Thiel is claiming that scientists are too dogmatic. As his evidence, he suggests that scientists regularly accuse people of being too skeptical of science, but never accuse anyone of being too dogmatic. There is some truth to what he's saying, but his examples of conflict between science and religious dogmatism are unfair. Science grew out of the quest for greater knowledge about God, seeking to answer the question, what kind of universe did God create? Scholasticism attempted to merge the best science of the day, Aristotle's, with Catholic teaching, believing that the two must not be in conflict since both must be true. The main difference between scholasticism and the later scientific revolution was not in their relative skepticism or dogmatism, but rather in the questions they asked. Scholastics were interested in questions like, is there a God, and how can I prove he exists? Do we have souls, and what are they? Today, these are seen as theological or philosophical questions, but at the time, no boundary between scientific questions and big questions, that today we believe have no scientific answer, existed. The method of scientific inquiry in which one forms a hypothesis and then attempts to disprove or falsify that hypothesis is grounded in scholasticism. While the scholastics were not interested in empirical evidence, they did lay the groundwork for evaluating evidence impartially and logically. Scholasticism's great enemy was not skepticism, but extreme dogmatism from the church authorities and groups such as the Fideists, who denied the utility of reason. Ironically, scholastics are remembered now as dogmatic when they were the skeptical ones, and often risked censure by the Roman Catholic Church. A couple of centuries later, scholasticism itself became the basis for Roman Catholic theology and has since been taught dogmatically. For example, transubstantiation, the literal transformation of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, is explained using concepts of substance and form developed by Aristotle. The beginnings of science, meanwhile, occurred because scholars of the Renaissance and early modern period took the scholastic approach to reality and added empirical evidence. Francis Bacon, 16th century philosopher, father of empiricism, and poster boy for secular science, wrote in 1605, "For certain it is that God worketh nothing in nature but by second causes." Bacon means that everything in nature stems from God as the primary cause. He then writes, "A little or superficial knowledge of philosophy may incline the mind of man towards atheism, but a farther proceeding therein doth bring the mind back again to religion." The concept that scientists had to battle the dogma of the Catholic Church was true at times, but the Church also fostered science. Why do we think that science became so strong in Christian Europe? If you look at another religion, Islam, you see a rise of science in the 8th century, much earlier than in Christendom, followed by a decline after the 13th. This is because the relationship between the religious authorities and scientific knowledge changed. Islam became extremely dogmatic, embracing its own form of fideism, while the Church became less so with scholasticism and even less with the Renaissance. The unfortunate battle between Galileo and Pope Urban, often held up as an example of the Church suppressing science, was far more complex than a church merely trying to bludgeon well-meaning scientists with religious dogmas. Galileo's abrasive personality, his proximity to the Pope, and that his theory appeared to contradict the evidence at the time because stellar parallax, the movement of the stars as the Earth orbits the Sun, had never been observed, all contributed to the unfortunate result. No one believed the stars were so far away that they would require far more advanced equipment to observe their movement. Stellar parallax would not be observed for over 200 years after Galileo in the 1830. Only the preponderance of other evidence such as the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, and later the astonishing success of the Keplerian model solidified the heliocentric model. At the time, the Copernican theory was a poor predictor of planetary positions and seemed plain wrong. Thus, what appeared to be a case of scientific skepticism versus religious dogmatism was a case of scientific skepticism versus scientific dogmatism. Nevertheless, Galileo's theory won out because, however slowly, when allowed to proceed, science corrected itself. Fast forward to 2024, and we see scientific dogmatism everywhere, but dogmatism that comes not out of ideology, but a consensus based on evidence. And isn't that how science is supposed to work? Are we not supposed to close in on the truth and once having found it, establish it against all attacks? Well, no. Science does need to be defended against those who seek to suppress it or alter it for ideological reasons, as happened in the 1960s in the Soviet Union with Lysenkoism. But it doesn't need to be defended from attacks based on evidence. Unfortunately, many scientists do self-censor and censor other scientists who question consensus results. And that comes from a recent shift in the philosophical underpinnings of science. Science as an institution today contains two warring factions who may not even know they are members of those factions, or that they subscribe to certain underlying philosophies for their worldviews. On one side, we have the Kuhnians. In 1962, science philosopher Thomas Kuhn published a thin volume titled The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This landmark treatise laid out a theory for how science progresses through a series of revolutions interspersed with quiet periods of incremental progress. The idea behind his theory is that scientists form paradigms, which one can think of as frameworks, to which they dogmatically adhere. Eventually, when those frameworks begin to break down because of the accumulation of contrary evidence, a revolution occurs. The old guard is put away or retired. The new revolutionaries take over and establish the new paradigm, and things return to the old quiet pace, but now in a new paradigm. This theory that science works through volcanic paradigm shifts rather than through continuous progress means that, while science continues to use reason to evaluate evidence within the framework of the current paradigm to refine theories, criticism of the framework itself is not well tolerated. Scientists with established careers are expected to resist vigorously any attempt to overturn the framework to which they have dedicated their lives. Kuhn's theory is postmodernist because it questions the absoluteness of truth in science. Rather, it suggests that, while genuine progress does happen, truth is always contextual. Pre-relativity, Newton's laws were absolute. After relativity, they are mere approximations. Their truth has been downgraded. Although postmodernism saw its heyday in the 1960s, its cultural outflow has only made it into broader society, which includes scientists more recently, and many scientists have adopted the Kuhnian viewpoint without perhaps realizing where it comes from. The result is an oddly self-fulfilling prophecy. As scientists have become more Kuhnian in their outlook, they have become more dogmatic about the need to maintain the current framework of consensus viewpoints. For example, Kuhn claimed that if a scientist performs an experiment that contradicts the status quo, then the failure is with the scientist and not the status quo. Failure to achieve a solution discredits only the scientist and not the theory. It is a poor carpenter who blames his tools. This has been reflected in the tendency in the past not to publish failures. Likewise, there is a disincentive to attempt to reproduce seminal results, which has led to a reproducibility crisis where results that are believed to be true based on only one or two studies. Because the status quo is assumed, scientists fail to carry out those studies. Even when results are generally reliable, their implications can be overblown. This result can be bad science influencing policy. Now, it is true that in many fields prevailing theories are repeatedly confirmed, not because people are attempting to reproduce prior studies, but because they are trying to prove new theories. Yet, in the Kuhnian mindset, these new theories exist within the same framework. They are refinements no matter how earth-shattering their proponents argue them to be. On the other hand, a truly worldview-changing paradigm is incommensurate with prior theories, meaning that they have different measures for correctness. Incommensurate comes from a word in mathematics. For example, a circle's radius and circumference are incommensurate because if the radius is measured in integer units, the circumference cannot be a whole number of units. Theories are incommensurate because, while they can be compared, they are evaluated using different criteria. For example, in the Copernican theory, the Sun is a central star, while in the Ptolemaic theory, the Sun is like another planet. How do you fit observations into these two theories? Fundamentally, Kuhn says that one can fit observations into either theory. You cannot proceed by careful steps and methodology from one framework to the other. You have to go all at once and reinterpret all observations differently. It is not a scientific shift, so much as a psychological and sociological shift. For Kuhnian scientists, results of studies have to be compared to the prevailing framework, and if the evidence is not overwhelming, those studies must be rejected. According to Kuhn, however, paradigm shifts don't happen from overwhelming evidence, but generational shifts. Younger scientists are brought up in the context of major failures of current theories. Thus, they are more open-minded to complete shifts in the framework. If you ever hear a scientist say, "Extraordinary claims merit extraordinary evidence," they are being dogmatic. Extraordinary claims rarely get such evidence before acceptance. Such claims rather become science when a group of young scientists choose to pursue them despite weak or no evidence. The alternative philosophical school in science is that of Karl Popper. Popper was an early to mid-20th century philosopher of science, and you will hear many scientists refer to him when they say that a scientific hypothesis, in order to be considered one, must be falsifiable. This is a minimum requirement for a scientific theory, not the only one, but is essential. Popper's theory, in contrast to Kuhn's, is that scientists should rarely be dogmatic. A system such as classical mechanics may be scientific to any degree you like, but those who uphold it dogmatically, believing perhaps that it is their business to defend such a successful system against criticism as long as it is not conclusively disproved, are adopting the very reverse of that critical attitude, which in my view is the proper one for the scientist. Thus, while the Kuhnian scientist is expected to be dogmatic about their paradigm, the Popperian scientist is critical of all theories, even those with consensus support. Popper argued that a scientist must criticize every theory in as many ways as possible. The result is that vulnerabilities in theories can be removed or strengthened. Thus, for example, I should be ready to hear criticisms of quantum theory, Einstein's relativity, climate change science, and so on, because it is only by criticizing that science makes any progress. As Popper wrote in 1959, "Whenever we propose a solution to a problem, we ought to try as hard as we can to overthrow our solution rather than defend it. We do not do experiments to confirm or refine what we already know, but to try to find weaknesses." This is science done in the best scholastic tradition. Even Popper finds a place for dogmatism. In 1970, he wrote, "I have always stressed the need for some dogmatism. The dogmatic scientist has an important role to play. If we give in to criticism too easily, we shall never find out where the real power of our theories lies." Popper stresses that the dogmatic scientist can defend a theory that is nearly correct against an onslaught of criticism. Galileo was dogmatic about the Copernican model, even though it was only very nearly right, to the point of being placed under house arrest. This is a very different kind of dogmatism from Kuhn's. It means that a scientist who is on the track to an important discovery sometimes must be dogmatic about their own theories so that they do not collapse under the weight of criticism. Popper did not think much of Kuhn's status quo defending dogmatic scientist as he wrote in 1970. In my view, the normal scientist, as Kuhn describes him, is a person one ought to be sorry for. He has been taught in a dogmatic spirit. He is a victim of indoctrination. He has learned a technique which can be applied without asking for the reason why, especially in quantum mechanics. The Popperian scientist today tends to see themselves as the outsider, the critic of all that the scientific establishment claims to uphold. They may see themselves as having the answer to science's problems, or at least some of them. The Popperian scientist is quite rare within the scientific establishment now. 21st century science is risk-averse and driven by metrics. Dollars grant money won, number of papers published, number of citations, number of conferences invited to, etc. Critiques of the work of others, especially if that work is generally accepted, rarely generate a lot of citations unless it is a debate between some big-name scientists. If a scientist questions a politically sensitive topic, climate change, race, gender, vaccines, etc., they may even face more serious repercussions. This is true whether their critique is to one side or the other of the prevailing belief system. Scientists aren't that interested in criticism. Their employers, academic institutions, and their government backers, like normal science, because it is predictable and easy to measure. Kuhn has won. Thus, I tend to agree with Thiel that science has become dogmatic both within itself and even more so relative to the public. There are several culprits here. One is the perverse incentive structure that scientists experience. Unlike in the product-oriented, idea factory-centered culture in which Thiel lives, the merit of scientific ideas is hard to judge. There aren't dollars attached to success, but rather bodies of evidence that may not materialize for decades. Science as a culture no longer has room for anyone who can't show immediate impact. Thus, that impact must be measured in proxy, using attention from other scientists and funding agencies. But that incentivizes not sticking your neck out too far. Just enough to stand above the pack, but not so much you become a target. It also means that the kind of Popperian dogmatism that exemplified Galileo continues to be extremely important, but has also become more rare, especially at funding agencies. The decades-long effort to fund gravitational wave detectors is an example that bucks that trend, but in general, funding wants immediate results. To achieve a true paradigm shift takes faith, but also money. Galileo ran his own business selling telescopes. Many 20th century giants in physics might not even be able to keep an academic job now, with Peter Higgs, who predicted the Higgs boson 5 decades before its discovery, being a prime example. The best way to change that culture is at the top with money. Funding right now is highly focused on achieving specific measurable results. Yet funding agencies have some control over what kinds of questions they pay scientists to study. Funding agencies are largely on a risk-averse track to appear to provide value for taxpayer dollars. They should focus on both long-term moonshot efforts, high risk and high reward, as well as critiquing existing dogma, which has the benefit that theories with weaknesses can be refined or torn down. Both of these approaches challenge the dogmatism of the Kuhnian culture and act to disrupt normal science. Popper also encourages scientists to keep the faith and stand firm in the face of criticism. This is especially important in a culture where swimming upstream tends to be punished. If you do stick to your guns, however, you have to be relentlessly self-critical as well, or you may degenerate into crackpot territory, becoming impervious to all criticism, rather than doing the work to refine your ideas. Remember, Galileo was right. But his theory was a poor fit to measurement because it needed refining that only came with Brahe and Kepler. You may not live to see your ideas vindicated, and no one may be willing to pay you to study them. People are being too dogmatic in science, largely because it pays to be dogmatic. People respect you for keeping the faith, particularly against the perceived anti-science commentators on social media. Within science, it is almost never a bad idea to stick with the consensus and cite the most cited papers, just like everyone else. But in the end, science can't progress that way. We can't wait generations for a few mavericks to change everything. And with our calcifying institutions, we risk making those few extinct. We need progress now. We need skepticism now. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you soon again in the next video. Until then, good night and stay curious.